What if you woke up one day and your job was to be a living symbol? What if getting dressed took 3 hours in a committee of 12 people? What if your children were taken from you the moment they were born, raised by strangers as property of the state? What if you were never, ever allowed to be alone, not even to use the bathroom? This was the reality for Habsburg Empress. It was a life of unbelievable wealth and zero freedom. A daily grind designed to crush the individual and uphold an empire. Number 22, what did it take to get dressed? An empress never dressed herself. It could take a team of a dozen women up to 3 hours. A single formal court gown could weigh 30 pounds, not including the jewels. Underneath it all, her corset was so tight it could permanently warp her ribs. The process began the moment she woke up. It was not a simple matter of choosing an outfit. The mistress of the robes, a high-ranking noblewoman, would have already selected the appropriate attire based on the day's schedule. There was a dress for morning prayers, a different one for receiving audiences, another for the afternoon ride, and a highly formal creation for dinner or a court ball. Nothing was left to chance. Every color, every fabric, every jewel had a meaning. It was a uniform, not a wardrobe. First came the undergarments, fine linen, chemises, drawers, and multiple petticoats. These were the easy part. Then came the main event, the corset. This was not a fashion accessory, it was a piece of engineering. Made of whalebone and stiff fabric, it was designed to create the impossibly small waist demanded by court fashion. Two ladies in waiting, known as dressers, would hold it in place, while another pulled the laces from behind. They pulled until the Empress could barely breathe. The goal for Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, was a waist measurement of 19 inches. Sometimes it was as small as 16. This daily compression took a toll. It restricted breathing, made digestion difficult, and over time could shift the placement of internal organs. Fainting was common and even expected. Once the corset was laced, the cage crinoline or bustle was tied around her waist. This framework of steel hoops and fabric would give the skirt its massive bell-like shape. It was cumbersome and made navigating doorways a practice skill. Over this went more petticoats, often made of starched muslin or horsehair, to add volume and rustle. Finally, the gown itself. These were masterpieces of silk, satin, and brocade, often heavy with metallic thread and hand-sewn pearls. A formal Spanish court dress, the required uniform at the Habsburg Palace for centuries, was particularly rigid. It had a stiff V-shaped bodice that flattened the chest and a massive, heavy skirt. Lifting this onto the Empress was a two-person job. It was fastened with a complex series of hooks and eyes. The sleeves were then attached separately. The work was not done. The jewels came next. The Habsburg treasury was legendary. Tiaras, necklaces, earrings, bracelets, and brooches were not just adornments, they were symbols of the dynasty's power and wealth. The crown jewels were state property, and their use was strictly regulated. An empress might wear millions of dollars worth of diamonds to dinner. This added more weight and more security concerns. She was always accompanied by guards, partly to protect her, and partly to protect the gems she wore. Then came the gloves, the fan, and the handkerchief, each with its own etiquette. A fan was not just for cooling off, it was a tool for communication, with subtle gestures conveying messages across a crowded room. The shoes were often made of silk to match the gown, beautiful but impractical and uncomfortable for the hours of standing required. This entire ritual happened in reverse at the end of the day. The same team was required to undress her, carefully removing each layer and cataloging the jewels to be returned to the treasury. For the Empress, her body was not her own. It was a mannequin to be dressed and displayed for the benefit of the empire. The clothes were a cage, a beautiful, jewel-encrusted cage that reminded her of her duty every single moment of the day. Number 21. Could you ever just eat a meal? An empress rarely ate alone. For formal dinners, hundreds of people might watch her eat. She was served first, but by the time the lowest-ranking guest was served, her food was cold. Under the strict Spanish court etiquette, speaking during the meal was forbidden. The only sounds were the clinking of silver on porcelain. Public dining was a core part of court life. It was called the öffentliche Tafel, or public table. It was a performance, a ritual to demonstrate the hierarchy and stability of the court. The empress and emperor would sit at a raised table, often under a canopy, while the court assembled to watch them. Not to eat with them, but simply to stand and observe. It was considered a great honor to be granted permission to watch the monarchs dine. The etiquette was suffocatingly precise, a remnant of the rigid protocols imported from the Spanish court in the 16th century. This Spanish's hofceremonial dictated every single movement, the number of steps a servant could take, who could hand a plate to whom, how a glass of water was presented. It was all choreographed. An empress could not simply ask for salt. She had to make a subtle gesture to a lady in waiting who would convey the request to a page, who would then inform the official responsible for the salt cellar. The food itself was elaborate. Dozens of courses were prepared by an army of cooks, but the empress herself often ate very little. The process was so slow. By the time the complex chain of servants delivered a dish to her, and then proceeded to serve the entire table in descending order of rank, a significant amount of time had passed. The emperor was served, then the empress, then the archdukes and archduchesses, and so on. If she finished a course before the last person was served, she had to wait. Empress Sisi famously detested this ritual. She was intensely private and conscious of her figure. The idea of being watched while she ate was a kind of torture for her. She often claimed to have no appetite, picking at her food or eating nothing at all. She found ways to escape these public meals, preferring to dine alone in her chambers on a simple broth or a glass of milk. This was seen as a shocking break with tradition. Maria Theresa, on the other hand, had a healthier approach. She had a robust appetite and saw the public table as part of her duty. She ate heartily, much to the concern of her doctors, but she understood that her presence and participation were essential to the performance of monarchy. Even a private family meal was not truly private. A host of servants was always present, standing silently against the walls, observing everything. Conversation was stilted, always conscious of the listening ears. For an empress, a meal was never about nourishment or pleasure. It was about politics, duty, and the relentless performance of her role. It was another stage on which she was the main attraction, a silent, gilded figurehead, moving a fork from her plate to her mouth in perfect, prescribed motions. The pressure to perform, even in the seemingly simple act of eating, was immense. At number 20, how heavy was a crown of hair? Empress Sisi's hair reached the floor. It was so thick and heavy that she often suffered from severe headaches. Washing it took an entire day and used dozens of egg yolks and a bottle of cognac. She had a personal hairdresser who was paid a small fortune and was sworn to secrecy about any fallen hairs. Sisi's hair was her most famous feature and her greatest burden. It became a central part of her identity and a focus of her daily routine. Her hair was a chestnut brown and, when unpinned, cascaded past her ankles. It was her private obsession and a public symbol of her beauty. The care it required was a full-time job, both for her and for her personal hairdresser, Fanny Feifelick. The daily ritual of combing and braiding her hair took, at a minimum, 3 hours. Sisi would sit in a chair while Fanny carefully worked through the massive tresses. A white cloth was spread on the floor beneath her chair to catch any hairs that fell out. After each session, Fanny had to present the collected hairs to the Empress in a silver bowl for inspection. The Empress's mood for the day could depend on the number of hairs in that bowl. It was a source of constant anxiety. To soothe the Empress, Fanny developed a trick. She would hide some of the fallen hairs in her apron pocket by using a piece of sticky tape. The sheer weight of her hair, when braided and pinned into elaborate coronets on top of her head, was immense. It pulled at her scalp and the muscles in her neck, frequently causing debilitating headaches. To relieve the pressure, she would sometimes spend hours in her private chambers with her hair hung from the ceiling by ribbons, allowing the weight to be taken off her head. The washing process was an ordeal that happened only once every 3 weeks. It was an all-day affair. The Empress's private apartments would be cleared. The recipe for the shampoo was a closely guarded secret, a concoction of raw eggs and French cognac. It took several hours to apply the mixture and then rinse it out with warm water. Afterward, Sisi would put on a long, waterproof dressing gown and walk back and forth in her room until her hair was dry. She refused to use towels or heat, believing it would damage the strands. The entire day was canceled for this ritual. No appointments, no family duties, no public appearances. Her hair was more than just hair. It was a tool of power and a shield. Her beauty, defined by her hair and her figure, was one of the few things she felt she could control in a life that was otherwise completely managed by the court. But this control came at a high price. The time and energy devoted to its care were staggering. It isolated her. While her hair was being dressed, she would study languages or read. It was the only time she could be still and force others to wait for her. It was a source of pride, but also a heavy, gilded chain. Number 19 was giving birth a public spectacle. When a Habsburg Empress gave birth, the doors to her chamber were opened. Dozens of high-ranking courtiers, ministers, and foreign ambassadors filed in to witness the event. This was not for support. It was to verify that the child was a legitimate heir and that no substitute baby had been smuggled in. The Empress had no privacy in her most vulnerable moment. The birth of an heir was not a private family affair. It was an event of state. The survival of the dynasty depended on it, so the state demanded witnesses. As the Empress went into labor, the antechamber of her apartment would fill with people. The Lord Chamberlain, the Chancellor, and other key figures of the government were required to be present. The Empress herself would be in her bed, surrounded by a crowd of physicians, midwives, and her most senior ladies-in-waiting. But just beyond the bed, separated only by a low screen, were the official witnesses. They could hear every sound. As soon as the baby was born, it was whisked away, washed, and then presented to the assembled crowd. The gender was announced, and if it was a boy, the news would be met with relief and celebration. Cannons would be fired from the city walls to announce the birth of a new archduke. A girl was a disappointment. Maria Theresa, the only female ruler in 650 years of Habsburg history, endured this ordeal 16 times. Her pregnancies were almost constant for 2 decades. She understood the political necessity of producing heirs, a spare for every heir. She treated her pregnancies as part of her job. She would continue to conduct state business, receive ministers, and sign documents even while in labor. Her resilience was legendary, but the physical toll was enormous. For a young empress like Sisi, this public ritual was a horror. She was shy and valued her privacy above all else. The idea of giving birth before an audience of government officials was deeply traumatic. For the birth of her first child, Sophie, she was just 16 years old. Her formidable mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, orchestrated the entire event, ensuring every rigid protocol was followed. Sisi felt like a broodmare, her body serving a function for the state with no regard for her personal feelings or comfort. The medical care during childbirth was primitive. Doctors had little understanding of hygiene, and childbed fever was a common and often fatal infection. Anesthetics were not yet in use. The Empress endured excruciating pain under the gaze of a room full of strangers. Once the child was born and verified, it was handed over to a team of nurses and governesses. The Empress's job was done. She would see her child only at scheduled times. The nursery was a separate department of the court, controlled not by the mother, but by a high-ranking governess who answered to the emperor or, in Sisi's case, to her mother-in-law. Childbirth was not the beginning of motherhood. It was the conclusion of a political duty. Number 18, how long did you have to grieve? When a member of the imperial family died, the court went into a strict, lengthy period of mourning. An empress might be required to wear black for a full year. She would be forbidden from attending any parties, concerts, or theater. Her public appearances would be restricted to solemn religious services. Court mourning was not a personal expression of grief. It was a highly regulated public performance. The rules were laid out in the same book of court ceremonial that dictated everything else. The duration and depth of the mourning depended on the rank of the deceased relative. The death of a monarch or a direct heir plunged the court into the deepest level of mourning. For the empress, this meant a complete change of wardrobe and lifestyle. All color vanished. Her gowns were made of plain black, non-reflective fabrics like wool or crepe. Her jewels were put away, replaced by simple pieces made of jet or black enamel. Even her handkerchiefs had to have a thick black border. Her carriages were draped in black, and the livery of her servants was changed to black. The imperial apartments themselves might have rooms draped in black cloth. The social isolation was profound. The vibrant court life of balls, receptions, and banquets came to a complete halt. The theaters were closed. Music was silenced. For an empress, whose life was a series of public events, this meant long periods of confinement within the palace walls. Her days were filled with religious services and prayers for the soul of the departed. Maria Theresa provides the most extreme example. After her beloved husband, Francis Stephen, died in 1765, she entered a state of perpetual mourning for the rest of her life. She cut off her hair, gave away all her colorful clothes and jewels, and wore only black widow's weeds for her remaining 15 years. She had her rooms in the Hofburg painted black and decorated with grim images. Her grief was genuine, but her performance of it was also a powerful political statement. It reinforced her image as the devoted widow and the solemn matriarch of her empire. This enforced grief could be emotionally draining. An empress had to project an image of solemnity and sorrow, regardless of her true feelings. She might not have been close to the deceased distant cousin, whose death required 6 weeks of half mourning, but she had to perform the role perfectly. A smile at the wrong time or a piece of lace that was not sufficiently somber could cause a scandal. And mourning protocols extended even to writing paper. All correspondence from the court had to be on paper with a black border, the thickness of which indicated the depth of mourning. For an empress who spent hours a day on her official and personal letters, this was a constant, tangible reminder of the Obawi Azujati rules. Grief was not a private process. It was a public duty, another exhausting role to be played on the imperial stage. Number 17 was faith a choice or a job. An empress was expected to attend mass every single day. She had a personal confessor who was a constant presence at court and often wielded significant political influence. Her piety was not a private matter. It was a public performance of the dynasty's role as the defender of the Catholic faith. Failure to appear devout was not an option. The Habsburg dynasty built its identity on being the foremost Catholic power in Europe. The emperor was not just a secular ruler. He held the title of apostolic majesty granted by the Pope. The empress, as his consort, was the leading female figure of this Catholic empire. Her personal faith was secondary to her official role as a model of piety. Her day was structured around religious observance. It began with private prayers in her personal chapel. Then came the daily mass in the main palace chapel, attended by the entire court. This was a public event with the empress on full display. Her posture, her expression of devotion, her every gesture was watched and judged. On major religious holidays like Easter or Corpus Christi, the rituals were even more elaborate and demanding. There were long processions, hours of services, and public acts of devotion. One of the most famous rituals was the Fußwaschung, or foot washing, on Maundy Thursday. The emperor and empress would publicly wash the feet of 12 old men and 12 old women, in imitation of Christ washing the feet of the apostles. It was a powerful symbol of monarchical humility and piety, but it was also a highly staged, choreographed performance. The empress's confessor was a key figure in her life. He was her spiritual guide, but his role often bled into the political. He had the empress's ear and could influence her opinions on matters of state, appointments, and policy. For an empress like Maria Theresa, who was deeply and genuinely devout, her faith guided her actions as a ruler. Her confessors were important advisors. For others who may have been less naturally inclined to piety, the constant presence of a confessor was a source of pressure and scrutiny. She was also the chief patron of countless convents, monasteries, and religious charities. A significant portion of her day could be taken up with correspondence and audiences related to these religious foundations. She was expected to be charitable, to embody the Christian virtue of caring for the poor and sick. These charitable acts were often public, designed to bolster the image of the monarchy. There was no room for religious doubt or skepticism. The empress's role was to be the unwavering female pillar of the Catholic state. She had to set an example for her subjects, for her children, and for the other courts of Europe. For a woman of genuine faith, this role might have been a comfort. For a woman who felt differently, it would have been a suffocating, lifelong performance. Her soul, like her body, belonged to the dynasty. Number 16, could you ever be alone? An empress was never truly alone. From the moment she woke until the moment she went to sleep, she was surrounded by ladies in waiting. They were present, when she dressed, when she ate, when she read, and when she wrote letters. Even the door to her bedroom was not locked. A lady-in-waiting slept in an adjoining room, ready to be called at a moment's notice. Privacy was a concept that did not exist. This constant surveillance was part of the system of court life. It was a matter of security, tradition, and control. The empress was the most valuable woman in the empire, and her every move was of consequence. The court did not trust her to be unsupervised. Her household was a rigid hierarchy of women, headed by the Oberstofmeisterin or mistress of the court. This was the highest ranking woman at court, a powerful figure who managed the empress's entire staff and schedule. Under her were the ladies-in-waiting, known as damen, who were themselves high-ranking noblewomen. Serving as a lady-in-waiting was a prestigious position for a young woman from an aristocratic family. Their job was to be the empress's companions and assistants. They would read to her, play music with her, and accompany her on walks or carriage rides. But their presence was also a form of monitoring. They were witnesses to her life. Anything she said or did could be reported back to the mistress of the court, or to the empress's mother-in-law, or even to the emperor himself. The court was a web of intrigue, and the empress's private chambers were its center. Even the most personal moments were semi-public. When she used the chamber pot, a lady-in-waiting stood nearby, holding a towel. When she took a bath, several were on hand to assist her. This lack of basic privacy was a profound shock to many young princesses who married into the Habsburg court. Empress Sisi found this constant presence unbearable. She craved solitude. She tried to create small pockets of privacy for herself. She took long, strenuous hikes, often trying to outpace her ladies-in-waiting to snatch a few moments alone. She had a gymnasium fitted out in the Hofburg where she could exercise, an unconventional activity that baffled the court. But even there, a lady-in-waiting was required to be present. Her study of languages was another escape. While her hair was being dressed for hours, she would insist on silence from her attendants so she could focus on her Greek or Hungarian lessons. It was a way of creating an internal space of privacy when she had no physical space. The system was designed to prevent the empress from having a private life, private thoughts, or private relationships. Her friendships were scrutinized. Her correspondence was not sealed by her own hand. It was open to inspection. She was a public figure 24 hours a day. The psychological toll of never being able to relax, to be unobserved, to simply be oneself was immense. It was a gilded cage where the walls were made of people. Number 15, what was in the morning's mail? The Empress's day often began with a mountain of paper. She received hundreds of letters, petitions, and official documents that required her attention. These were not casual notes. They were pleas for help from her subjects, diplomatic reports, and intricate letters from her family members scattered across the royal courts of Europe. She was expected to read them and, in many cases, to respond personally. This was not a task she could delegate entirely. While secretaries could handle the routine correspondence, many letters required her direct input. The mailbag was a direct line to the heart of the empire's problems and the complex web of European politics. A large portion of the mail consisted of petitions. Ordinary people from across the vast Habsburg lands saw the empress as a maternal figure, an intercessor who might take pity on their plight. And a farmer whose crops had failed, a widow who had lost her pension, a soldier seeking a promotion. They all wrote to the empress. Reading these stories of hardship day after day was an emotional burden. She could not help everyone, but she was expected to show compassion. A small staff was dedicated to sorting these petitions, and a portion of her personal budget, her pin money, was often used to provide charitable relief in cases she selected. Then there was the diplomatic and political correspondence. While the emperor handled the primary affairs of state, the empress was often deeply involved in the politics of the court and in the family business of European royalty. Maria Theresa, as a ruling sovereign, was a master of this. She maintained a vast network of correspondence, using letters to gather information, issue instructions, and conduct diplomacy. She wrote thousands of letters in her lifetime, many of them lengthy and detailed, all by her own hand. For a consort empress, the family correspondence was a crucial part of her job. The Habsburgs were masters of marriage politics. Their archduchesses were married off to kings and princes across the continent. The empress was the matriarch at the center of this network. Her daughters, like Marie Antoinette in France and Maria Carolina in Naples, were expected to write home regularly. These letters were not just family gossip, they were filled with political intelligence, observations about the foreign court, and pleas for advice. The Empress, in turn, would write back with instructions reminding her daughters that their first loyalty was always to the Habsburg dynasty. Reading between the lines of these letters and crafting careful replies was a high-stakes game of political chess. This work required hours of focused attention every day. It had to be done in addition to all her other ceremonial duties. The Empress would sit at her desk, often with a lady-in-waiting reading aloud to her, and dictate responses to a secretary. It was relentless, mentally exhausting work. The mailbag was a daily reminder of the immense scope of her responsibilities, from the personal sorrows of a single subject to the fate of nations. Number 14, how many hours could you stand still? A significant part of an empress's life was spent standing. She stood for hours during court receptions, religious ceremonies, and official audiences. She had to stand perfectly still, with perfect posture, wearing heavy gowns and uncomfortable shoes, often without showing any sign of fatigue. It was a physical endurance test disguised as a ceremony. The court calendar was a relentless series of events that required the empress's presence. A major reception, or circle, was a prime example. The empress and emperor would stand in the center of a grand hall as hundreds, sometimes thousands, of aristocrats, diplomats, and officials filed past them. Each person had to be greeted. This involved a nod, a slight curtsy, and perhaps a few polite words. And the empress had to remember names, titles, and the political significance of each person. The entire process could last for 3 or 4 hours, with no opportunity to sit down or rest. His religious services were another major source of physical strain. A high mass on a major feast day could last for several hours. The imperial family did not sit in a comfortable pew. They knelt on velvet cushions in a prominent gallery in full view of the congregation. They were expected to remain in a posture of devout prayer for the entire duration. Even a simple daily audience was a formal affair. The empress would receive individuals or delegations in a specific reception room. She would stand, usually with her ladies-in-waiting standing a few paces behind her, while the visitor approached, bowed, or curtsied, and stated their business. She remained standing until the audience was concluded. This constant standing was made more difficult by the clothes she wore. The heavy brocade and silk gowns, the restrictive corsets, and the impractical silk shoes all added to the discomfort. The weight of the dress pulled on her shoulders and back. The corset restricted her breathing. Her feet would ache and swell. But she was not allowed to show it. Any sign of weakness or fatigue would be seen as a failure, a crack in the perfect facade of majesty. Young empresses had to be trained for this. They were taught how to stand, how to walk, and how to curtsy with grace, all while managing a heavy train and a rigid bodice. It was a physical skill, like ballet, that required practice and discipline. Empress Sisi, with her focus on physical fitness, was better equipped to handle the physical demands than many of her predecessors. But even she found the endless standing tedious and draining. It was one of the reasons she began to withdraw from court life as she grew older. She preferred to be in motion, riding horses for hours or taking long, fast-paced walks. The static, suffocating formality of court ceremonies was the opposite of everything she craved. For any empress, this physical demand was a core part of the job. Her body was an instrument of state, and its ability to endure hours of stillness was a testament to her discipline and her devotion to the role. Number 13, was your education for you or for the empire? A Habsburg archduchess, the future empress, did not receive an education for her own intellectual fulfillment. Her education was a carefully designed training program for her future role as a consort. She learned languages, music, and dance not as arts, but as political tools. She studied history not for its own sake, but to understand the dynastic alliances and rivalries of Europe. The curriculum was intensive but narrow. The primary focus was on languages. A future empress had to be fluent in German, the language of her new home. She also needed French, which was the international language of diplomacy and high society. Italian and Latin were also standard. She was expected to speak and write these languages perfectly without an accent, as her ability to converse with foreign ambassadors and dignitaries was a key part of her function. Music and dance were also essential. She had to play an instrument, like the harpsichord or piano, and sing passably. This was for the entertainment of the court and to show that she was a woman of culture. Dancing was even more important. All court balls were not just parties, they were political events. The ability to dance the minuet or the quadrille with grace and precision was a necessary skill. Choosing a dance partner was a political act. Art and drawing were taught as ladylike accomplishments. Your religion was a core subject, instilling in her the deep Catholic piety expected of a Habsburg Empress. She learned the catechism, the lives of the saints, and the rituals of the church. What was missing from this education was significant. She was generally not taught science, mathematics, economics, or political theory. These subjects were considered the domain of men. Her knowledge of history focused on genealogy, who was related to whom, which royal house had a claim to which territory. It was a practical guide to the European power structure. Maria Theresa was a notable exception. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, realized that she might inherit the throne. While her formal education was still very traditional for a woman of her time, he allowed her to sit in on meetings of the Council of State. She learned about governance and policy not from textbooks but from practical observation. This gave her an invaluable and highly unusual preparation for her future role as ruler. Empress Sisi's education was more typical. She was raised in the much more informal Bavarian court. She learned languages and was a passionate reader of poetry, particularly Heine. But she had no training in politics or the rigid etiquette of the Habsburg court. When she arrived in Vienna at 16, she was completely unprepared for the role she was expected to play. Her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, immediately took charge of her re-education, drilling her in the protocols and expectations of her new life. The goal of this education was not to create an independent thinker. It was to produce a perfect consort, pious, graceful, multilingual, and deferential. Her mind, like everything else about her, was to be shaped to serve the needs of the dynasty. Number 12. What if your marriage was a business merger? And Empress did not marry for love. She married for the state. Her marriage was a diplomatic treaty, a business merger between two powerful dynasties. She was often married by proxy to a man she had never met, sometimes a man old enough to be her grandfather. Her duty was singular to produce a male heir. The process of arranging a royal marriage was a long and complex negotiation. It was handled by ambassadors and ministers, not by the couple themselves. The primary considerations were political. Would the alliance strengthen the empire? Would it secure a border? Would it neutralize an enemy? The personal compatibility of the bride and groom was a minor, if not irrelevant, detail. The bride's value was calculated in terms of her dowry, her fertility judged by the reproductive history of her family, and her political connections. She was a pawn in a vast game of European chess. Maria Theresa famously used her own children as instruments of foreign policy, marrying her daughters into the royal families of France, Spain, and Naples to create a network of alliances. She called it her marriage machine. Once the treaty was signed, a proxy wedding was often held in the bride's home country. A high-ranking nobleman would stand in for the groom. The young princess was now legally married to a complete stranger. She would then embark on a long journey to her new home. The journey itself was a public spectacle, with celebrations and receptions in every town she passed through. The first meeting with her actual husband was a highly orchestrated public event. There was no room for spontaneity or genuine emotion. The couple was expected to perform their roles as the happy bride and groom for the benefit of the court and the public. From the moment she arrived, the pressure began. The entire court, the entire empire was waiting for her to become pregnant. Her monthly cycle was a matter of state concern. If she failed to conceive quickly, it was considered her failure. The whispers and rumors would begin. Was she barren? Was the marriage a mistake? The age difference could be stark. Many princesses were married in their early teens to much older men. They were children thrust into a foreign court, into the bed of a stranger, and expected to perform the duties of a wife and a future mother. The relationship with the husband was secondary to the production of an heir. If affection or even friendship developed, it was a fortunate bonus, not an expectation. The empress's personal happiness was not part of the equation. Her body was the vessel for the next generation of the dynasty. Her marriage was her job, and her children were her product. It was a cold, pragmatic transaction dressed up in the pageantry of a royal wedding. Number 11. How do you manage a staff of 2,000? The Hofburg Palace in Vienna was not just a home, it was a small city. The imperial household, or Hofstaat, consisted of up to 2,000 people. The empress was the nominal head of her own household, but managing this vast and complex organization was a relentless and often thankless task. It was a world of rigid hierarchy, political infighting, and logistical nightmares. The household was divided into several major departments, each run by a high-ranking court official. The Lord High Steward was in charge of the entire operation. Under him were the officials responsible for the kitchens, the wine cellars, the stables, the imperial treasury, and the buildings themselves. The Empress's personal household was a sub-organization within this structure. It was headed by her mistress of the court, the Oberstofmeisterin. This woman was her chief of staff, her gatekeeper, and her chaperone. She managed the ladies in waiting, the dressers, the chambermaids, and all the other servants assigned to the Empress. She controlled who had access to the Empress, what her daily schedule looked like, and how her budget was spent. A good relationship with this official was crucial, but she was often an older, more conservative figure chosen to keep the young Empress in line. The court was a hotbed of ambition and jealousy. Every position, from the highest minister to the humblest footman, was part of a rigid system of rank and privilege. People jockeyed for promotions, for favor, for a better salary, or for a room with a better view. The Empress was constantly being drawn into these disputes. A lady in waiting might complain about another. A chef might be feuding with a butler. These seemingly minor issues could escalate into major court scandals if not handled carefully. Managing the budget was another major headache. The court was incredibly expensive to run. The Empress had her own budget, but it was managed by court officials and subject to scrutiny. Every expenditure from a new gown to a charitable donation was recorded. Logistics were a constant challenge. Just feeding the court required a massive operation. The imperial kitchens were a vast complex of rooms, staffed by hundreds of cooks, bakers, and scullions. Procuring the tons of meat, produce, and wine needed, each day was a full-time job. When the court traveled, the entire operation had to be packed up and moved. A journey from Vienna to Budapest or Prague was a military-level logistical exercise involving hundreds of carriages, thousands of horses, and the entire household staff. The Empress was at the top of this pyramid, but she was also trapped by it. She was surrounded by people whose job it was to serve her, but she had very little real power to change the system. The traditions and protocols of the household were centuries old and almost impossible to alter. She was less a manager and more a prisoner of the vast, inefficient, and politically charged machine that was the imperial court. Number 10, did you speak the right kind of German? At the Habsburg court, it was not enough to speak German. One had to speak Schönbrunner Deutsch, or Schönbrunn German. This was a specific, highly formal, and slightly archaic dialect spoken by the imperial family in the highest echelons of the aristocracy. It was characterized by a slow, deliberate pace and a distinct nasal intonation. A single grammatical mistake or a slip into a more common dialect could mark one as an outsider. For a foreign princess arriving at the court, mastering this specific way of speaking was a major challenge. It was one of the first and most important tests she had to pass. Her tutors would drill her for hours, correcting her pronunciation and grammar. The goal was to erase any trace of her native accent and replace it with the precise, emotionless cadence of the Habsburg court. This dialect was a powerful social marker. It immediately distinguished those who belonged to the inner circle from those who did not. It was a language of power, designed to be exclusive. It was intentionally difficult, filled with formal forms of address and complex grammatical structures that were no longer in common use. The pressure to speak perfectly was immense. The Empress was constantly in the public ear. She spoke with ministers, ambassadors, and courtiers. Every word was listened to and analyzed. A verbal slip could be interpreted as a sign of poor education, foreignness, or even intellectual weakness. Empress Sisi, who grew up speaking a much more relaxed Bavarian dialect of German, struggled with Schönbrunner Deutsch. She found it stilted and unnatural. Her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, was a stickler for protocol and constantly corrected Sisi's speech in front of others. This public humiliation was one of the many reasons for the tension between the two women. Cece's preference for speaking Hungarian later in her life was, in part, a rebellion against the linguistic tyranny of the Viennese court. This linguistic pressure was not limited to German. An empress was expected to be a polyglot. She needed to switch effortlessly between the formal German of the court, the elegant French of diplomacy, and the Italian used in many parts of the empire. When speaking to Hungarian delegations, a few words in their language were a political necessity. Each language had to be spoken with the correct accent and level of formality. Conversation at court was rarely casual. It was a performance, wit was valued, but it had to be subtle. The emotion was to be suppressed. The formal language of the court was a tool for maintaining distance and reinforcing hierarchy. For the empress, it was another layer of the rigid costume she had to wear every day. She could never just talk, she had to speak her lines. Number 9 was travel, a vacation. Imperial travel was not a holiday. It was a massive, slow, moving logistical operation that could involve thousands of people and cost a fortune. An empress did not simply pack a bag. The entire court, or a significant portion of it, traveled with her. The purpose was not relaxation, but to see and be seen, to reinforce the power of the monarchy in the provinces. A typical imperial journey, for example, from Vienna to Prague, was planned months in advance. An army of officials, the Hofreichsmarschalamt, was responsible for the arrangements. They mapped the route, arranged for supplies, and prepared the destination palaces. The imperial procession itself was a sight to behold. It could stretch for miles. At the head would be the gilded imperial carriages, each drawn by 6 or 8 perfectly matched horses. Behind them came carriages for the archdukes and archduchesses, the ladies in waiting, the high court officials and their staffs. Then came the baggage wagons, hundreds of them, carrying everything the court would need. This included furniture, bedding, tapestries, kitchen equipment, the contents of the wine cellar, and of course, the empress's extensive wardrobe. It was like moving a small town. Travel was slow. The procession moved at the speed of a walking horse, covering perhaps 20 miles on a good day. The roads were often poor. A journey that takes a few hours by car today could take weeks. The empress spent hour after hour inside a swaying, bumpy carriage. Along the entire route, the empress was on display. In every town and village, the local populace would line the roads to catch a glimpse of her. She was expected to smile and wave, to look serene and majestic no matter how tired or uncomfortable she was. Local dignitaries would present speeches of welcome, and she was expected to receive them graciously. These stops were not restful breaks, they were more work, more performance. When she finally arrived at her destination, whether it was a palace in Budapest or a castle in Innsbruck, her work was not done. The days were filled with a schedule of official events, formal receptions for the local nobility, visits to churches and convents, inspections of military garrisons, and gala performances at the theater. There was no spontaneity. Every moment was scheduled. A walk in the park was a public procession. A boat trip on a lake was a state event. Empress Cece, who loved to travel, tried to break free from the suffocating formality. She often traveled incognito using a pseudonym. She sought out remote places like the Greek island of Corfu, where she built her own palace, the Achilleon. This was her attempt to create a personal space to experience travel as a form of freedom rather than as another form of duty. But for most of the Habsburg era, an empress's journey was just another exhausting public and highly choreographed part of her job. Number 8. Who decided if you were sick? When an empress fell ill, her health was not her own concern. It became a matter of state. The court physicians, not the empress herself, diagnosed her condition and prescribed treatment. These treatments were often based on centuries-old theories and could be bizarre and ineffective. Her body belonged to the dynasty, and its health was a political issue. The empress had a team of personal physicians, or Leibarztei. These were the most respected doctors of their time, but their medical knowledge was limited by the standards of the era. They still subscribed to the theory of the 4 humors, believing that illness was caused by an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Common treatments included bloodletting. The empress would be bled, often from the arm or the foot, in an attempt to restore balance to her humors. This practice weakened the patient and could lead to infection, often making the original condition worse. Purges and emetics were also frequently prescribed to cleanse the body of supposed toxins. The empress's diet was strictly controlled when she was ill. She might be prescribed a southing diet of weak broth and gruel, or a strengthening diet that could include copious amounts of wine. The prescriptions for medicines were often strange concoctions of herbs, minerals, and animal products. The lack of understanding of mental health was particularly profound. Conditions like depression or anxiety were not seen as medical issues. An empress who suffered from what was then called melancholy, as Sisi did, was often accused of being willful, hysterical, or simply not performing her duties. The prescription was not therapy or rest, but a stern lecture to pull herself together and remember her obligations to the empire. Sisi's constant travel and obsessive exercising were her own self-prescribed treatments for her mental distress, a way to escape the stifling atmosphere of the court that she felt was the root of her illness. An empress's reproductive health was under the most intense scrutiny. Her menstrual cycles were tracked. Her ability to conceive and carry a child to term was of paramount importance. If she suffered a miscarriage, it was a state crisis. The physicians would descend, offering theories and prescribing remedies, all in a desperate attempt to ensure the production of an heir. The empress had little say in her own medical care. The physicians reported not just to her, but to the emperor. Her health was a state secret. If she was seriously ill, the court would try to manage the information released to the public to prevent panic or political instability. She was a patient with no rights, her body a territory to be managed and controlled by the men of the court and the medical establishment. Number 7. What if your mother-in-law ran your life? For many a young empress, her greatest challenge was not her husband or the demands of the court, but her mother-in-law. If the emperor's mother was still alive and present at court, she often held immense power as the dowager empress or archduchess. She saw it as her right and her duty to train the new young empress and to control every aspect of her life. The most famous example of this dynamic is the relationship between Empress Sisi and her aunt and mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie. Sophie was the dominant figure at the Viennese court. She was intelligent, ambitious, and deeply conservative. She had engineered her son Franz Joseph's ascent to the throne and saw herself as the guardian of the dynasty's traditions. From the moment the 16-year-old Sisi arrived in Vienna, Sophie took control. She criticized Sisi's informal manners, her accent, and her lack of knowledge of court protocol. She dictated Sisi's schedule, chose her ladies in waiting, and even monitored her wardrobe. Sophie was a formidable presence, and Sisi, young and insecure, was initially overwhelmed. The ultimate battleground was the nursery. When Sisi gave birth to her first child, a daughter also named Sophie, the Archduchess immediately took over. She decided the baby would be raised in her own apartments, not the Empress's. She appointed the nurses and governesses. Sisi was allowed to see her own child only at scheduled times. The Archduchess believed that Sisi was too young and flighty to be a suitable mother. For Sisi, this was a devastating blow. Her children were being taken from her, raised to be strangers. This pattern was repeated with her second child, Gisela. The Archduchess controlled their upbringing, their education, and their daily lives. It was only after a long and bitter struggle, and with the support of her husband, that Sisi was eventually able to gain more control over the raising of her third child, the Crown Prince Rudolph. This mother-in-law dynamic was not unique to Sisi. It was a common feature of royal courts. The older, established woman saw the new young wife as a potential rival and a threat to the established order. The mother-in-law held all the cards she knew the court, she had the emperor's ear, and she had the weight of tradition on her side. The young empress was in an impossible position. To defy her mother-in-law was to risk the displeasure of her husband and the entire court. To submit was to lose any sense of autonomy and to have her life completely controlled by another woman. It was a power struggle that played out in the private chambers of the palace, but had profound consequences for the empress's personal happiness and her public role. Number 6, did the job ever end? The role of empress was a life sentence. There was no retirement, no vacation, no off switch. From the day of her marriage until the day of her death, she was the empress. Her duties were relentless and the performance never stopped. It was a 24-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year job. Her days were rigidly scheduled from dawn until late at night. The schedule, known as the Tagesordnung, was set by her mistress of the court. It dictated when she would wake, when she would pray, when she would dress, who she would meet, when she would eat, and when she would attend public functions. There was little to no room for personal choice or spontaneity. Even her leisure activities were often part of her official duties. A walk in the palace gardens was a public appearance. A trip to the opera was a state occasion where she sat in the royal box, the subject of 1,000 gazes. Her hobbies were expected to be appropriately imperial. Things like needlework, painting, or charity work, all of which could be presented as examples of her virtue. There were no weekends off. The court calendar was busiest on Sundays and religious holidays with long church services and formal receptions. The summer months might be spent at a different palace like Schönbrunn or Laxenburg, but the routine of ceremony and duty traveled with the court. It was a change of scenery, not a break from work. The only way the job ended was through death. If her husband, the emperor, died first, her role changed, but it did not end. She became the Dowager Empress. She would yield precedence to the new empress, her daughter-in-law, but she remained a powerful and influential figure at court. She was expected to be the embodiment of dignified widowhood, a living symbol of the dynasty's past. As seen with Maria Theresa, this new role could be just as demanding as the old one. The relentless, lifelong nature of the job was a heavy psychological burden. It created a sense of being trapped. Every aspect of life, marriage, motherhood, friendship, illness was filtered through the lens of her imperial role. She could never be just a woman. She was always the empress. Empress Sisi's constant traveling in her later years was a desperate attempt to escape this reality. By staying away from Vienna and the Hofburg for months or even years at a time, she was abdicating the daily grind of her role. This was a radical and scandalous act. It was her form of retirement, a refusal to play the part until the very end. But even then, she could never fully escape. Wherever she went, she was still the Empress of Austria, a public figure hounded by protocol and curiosity until the day she was assassinated. The job only ended when her life did. Number 5, how did it feel to be a symbol? An empress was not primarily a person. She was a symbol. She was the living embodiment of the empire's majesty, piety, and fertility. Every action she took, every word she spoke, and every gown she wore was scrutinized for its symbolic meaning. The pressure to live up to this idealized image was crushing. First and foremost, she was a symbol of beauty and grace. Her appearance was a reflection on the empire itself. A beautiful empress was a source of national pride. This is why Empress Sisi's beauty was so important. Her famous hair, her slender figure, and her flawless complexion were celebrated throughout Europe. But this meant she had to work tirelessly to maintain that beauty. Her obsessive diet and exercise routines were not just vanity, they were part of her job. She was preserving a national asset. She was also a symbol of fertility. Her primary dynastic duty was to produce heirs. A pregnant empress was a symbol of the dynasty's future and the empire's stability. Her body was public property, its reproductive capacity a matter of national interest. When she successfully produced a male heir, she had fulfilled her most important symbolic function. Piety was another key aspect of her symbolic role. As the leading lady of a Catholic empire, she had to be a model of religious devotion. Her public attendance at Mass, her acts of charity, and her patronage of religious institutions all reinforced the dynasty's image as a pillar of the faith. She was also a symbol of culture and taste. The empress set the fashion for the entire empire. The colors she wore, the style of her gowns, the way she arranged her hair all were copied by the women of the aristocracy. Her patronage of the arts, music, and theater was also a reflection of the empire's cultural sophistication. This symbolic role left no room for individuality. The empress's personal feelings, opinions, and desires were irrelevant. She had to suppress her own personality and conform to the idealized image. If she was having a bad day, she still had to smile and wave at the crowds. If she disagreed with a policy, she had to remain silent and appear supportive of her husband, the emperor. The weight of being a symbol was immense. It was an abstract, dehumanizing pressure. Cece wrote poetry in secret to express the feeling of being trapped inside this public image. She felt a profound disconnect between her inner self and the external role of the Empress. She was constantly performing, acting out a part that had been written for her centuries before she was born. To be a symbol was to have your humanity erased and replaced with a beautiful, perfect, and hollow icon. Number 4, could you even buy your own things? Despite being surrounded by unimaginable wealth, an empress had very little financial independence. She did not have her own fortune. Her finances were controlled by the court, and she was given a specific allowance known as Nadelgeld pin money or Kammergelder chamber money. Every penny she spent was recorded and scrutinized by the court chamberlain. This allowance was intended to cover her personal expenses, her wardrobe, her charitable donations, and any personal gifts she might give. While the sum could be substantial, it was not unlimited, and it came with many strings attached. She could not simply go shopping. The empress did not handle money. If she wanted a new dress, the mistress of the robes would commission it from the court dressmaker. The bills would be sent to the court finance office for payment. If she wanted to buy a piece of jewelry, the court jeweler would bring a selection to the palace for her to view. The transaction would be handled by court officials. This lack of financial autonomy was a powerful form of control. It made her completely dependent on the emperor and the court administration. If an empress was deemed to be too extravagant, her allowance could be questioned or even restricted. Maria Theresa, as the sovereign ruler, had control over the state's finances, but even she was known for her personal frugality, keeping meticulous household accounts. She understood the symbolic importance of not being seen as wasteful with the state's resources. For a consort empress like Cece, the system was stifling. She had expensive tastes, particularly when it came to her horses and her private residences. Her spending was a frequent source of tension with the court, which saw her expenditures as frivolous. She had to request funds for the projects she cared about, like the construction of her palace in Corfu. Charity was one of the few areas where she had some discretion. A significant portion of her allowance was expected to be used for charitable works. She would receive thousands of petitions for financial help, and her office would dispense small sums to the needy. This was both a genuine act of benevolence and a required part of her public role as the compassionate mother of her people. The system meant that she never had the privacy or freedom of a normal financial transaction. Every purchase was a semi-official act. The bills and receipts created a paper trail of her life, all of it subject to the approval of the court bureaucracy. She was the richest woman in the empire in name, but in practice, she was a ward of the state with a generous but strictly controlled allowance. Number 3, were your children really yours? The moment an imperial child was born, it ceased to belong to the empress. The child belonged to the state. An entire separate household, the Kinderkammer Children's Chamber, was established for the royal offspring. The empress had little to no say in how her children were raised. Immediately after the public spectacle of the birth, the infant was handed over to a team of professionals. This team was headed by an Aja, a high-ranking noblewoman who served as the head governess. The Aja was a powerful figure who answered directly to the emperor, not the empress. She had total authority over the nursery. The Aja, along with a team of wet nurses, nannies, and tutors, raised the children according to a strict regimen. Their days were scheduled with lessons, meals, and playtime. The empress was not involved in these daily routines. She could not simply walk into the nursery to see her children. She had to request a formal visit, and the children would be brought to her clean and well-behaved at a pre-arranged time. This separation was devastating for many empresses, particularly for the young Cece. When her first daughter Sophie was born, Archduchess Sophie, her mother-in-law, appointed the Aja and had the nursery established near her own apartments. Cece was effectively shut out of her daughter's life. She wrote in her diary of her despair at hearing her baby cry in a distant room and being unable to go and comfort her. The justification for this system was that the empress was too busy with her ceremonial duties to be a full-time mother. It was also believed that she might spoil the children or raise them improperly. The education of a future emperor or archduchess was considered too important to be left to an inexperienced young woman. Their upbringing was a state project designed to mold them into their future roles. The children were taught from a young age that their primary loyalty was to the dynasty. They were often raised in a separate wing of the palace and saw their parents only for a short period each day. This created a formal and often distant relationship. Sisi fought bitterly against this system. The tragic death of her first daughter, Sophie, at the age of 2 while on a trip to Hungary, hardened her resolve. She blamed the grueling state visit for the child's illness. She eventually managed to convince her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph, to give her more control over the upbringing of her later children. This was a major break with Habsburg tradition and a source of significant conflict with her mother-in-law. But Sisi's victory was the exception, not the rule. For most Habsburg empresses, motherhood was a title, not a practice. Their children were their biological offspring, but they were raised by others to serve the dynasty. It was perhaps the most personal and heartbreaking sacrifice the job required. Number 2, how tightly could you breathe? The corset was the most essential and most brutal garment in an empress's wardrobe. It was worn every day, from morning until night. Its purpose was to create the idealized female silhouette of the era, a tiny waist, a full bust, and an erect posture. For an empress, it was not just a matter of fashion, it was a tool of discipline and a symbol of her aristocratic status. The process of being laced in was a daily ritual. The empress would hold onto a bedpost or a special bar while 1 or 2 ladies in waiting pulled the laces at her back with all their strength. The goal was to cinch the waist to an unnaturally small size. Empress Sisi was famous for her 19-inch waist, an achievement that required extreme and constant corseting. The physical effects were severe. The corset dramatically restricted breathing. An empress could only take shallow breaths from the top of her lungs, which is why fainting spells were common in crowded, stuffy ballrooms. It compressed the abdomen, interfering with digestion. Eating a large meal was physically impossible, which contributed to the delicate, bird-like appetites of many aristocratic women. Over the long term, the damage could be permanent. The constant pressure could deform the rib cage, pushing the lower ribs inward. Internal organs could be shifted from their natural positions. Chronic health problems from back pain to digestive issues were a common result. During pregnancy, a special, slightly looser corset was worn, but the idea of going without was unthinkable. Beyond the physical, the corset was a powerful tool of social control. It forced a woman to stand and sit upright, enforcing a posture of discipline and formality. It restricted her movement. Running, bending, or any form of strenuous activity was difficult or impossible. The corset helped to create the image of the delicate, refined lady who was above manual labor. For an empress, the corset was part of her uniform. It was the foundation upon which the magnificent court gowns were built. It created the rigid, doll-like torso that the fashion of the day demanded. To appear without it would have been a scandal, an unthinkable breach of decorum. Sisi, despite her obsession with her tiny waist, also felt the corset as a form of imprisonment. Her obsessive need to exercise was, in part, a rebellion against the physical confinement of her clothing. On her long walks or horseback rides, she would wear more flexible riding corsets, but she was never truly free of the constriction. The corset was a daily, physical reminder of the rigid and unforgiving demands of her role. It was the literal straitjacket of her profession. Number 1 was helping the poor performance. Charity was a fundamental duty of a Habsburg Empress. She was expected to be the mother of her people, a compassionate figure who cared for the poor and the sick. But these acts of charity were rarely private or spontaneous. They were highly ritualized, public performances designed to enhance the image and popularity of the monarchy. One of the most important charitable rituals of the year was the Fußwaschung, or foot washing, on Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday. This ceremony was a reenactment of Christ washing the feet of his apostles. In a grand hall of the Hofburg, the emperor and empress would wash the feet of 12 old men and 12 old women who were chosen from the city's poor. The event was meticulously staged. The old people were bathed and given new clothes before the ceremony. The empress would kneel on a cushion, and a basin of water would be brought to her. She would pour a small amount of water over the feet of each of the 12 women and gently dry them with a towel. It was a powerful piece of political theater, broadcast to the entire empire as a sign of the ruler's humility and piety. After the washing, the old people were given a feast and a purse of money. The Empress was also the patron of numerous orphanages, hospitals, and convents. She was expected to make regular formal visits to these institutions. These visits were not surprises. They were planned well in advance. The institution would be cleaned and scrubbed, and the residents would be dressed in their best clothes. The Empress would walk through the wards or dormitories, speaking a few kind words to a sick person or a child, her ladies-in-waiting following behind her with baskets of food or gifts. Newspapers would report on the visit in glowing terms, praising the Empress's kindness and compassion. A large part of her correspondence consisted of petitions from the poor. Her staff would sort through them, and she would allocate funds from her personal allowance to help the most deserving cases. This was a more private form of charity, but it was still part of her official function. This is not to say that the Empress's compassion was not genuine. Many, like Maria Theresa, took their charitable duties very seriously and were deeply moved by the plight of their subjects. But the system in which they operated turned charity into a performance. An act of kindness was also an act of statecraft. It was another facet of the endless, exhausting job of being a living symbol. The goal was not just to help an individual in need, but to reinforce the idea of the monarchy as a benevolent, paternalistic institution with the Empress as its gentle, caring heart. It was the final and perhaps most subtle performance in the daily grind.